You are one of very, very few Britons who's recently been to Gaza.
The health ministry have lied and lied and lied throughout this war. Things like the Al Ahli Arab hospital bombing. They claimed 500 people had died when Israel hit a hospital, and that went globally worldwide. The next day it turned out 50 people were dead and they'd hit the car park, and it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket.
So we're not just talking now about the usual suspects beating the streets with their Palestine flags and saying Israel is committing genocide. Governments have said it.
We are the first government to say what Israel is doing is genocide.
I've started reacting with almost contempt at this point, because it's so demonstrably like genocide that actually, by giving it a serious answer and a serious rebuttal, you're almost dignifying these outrageous blood libels.
Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Mark Carney, all of whom said they will recognise the state of Palestine.
There are drops of blood on the hands of these leaders. They have very possibly killed hostages.
We talked about the right of the Palestinians to recognition.
Of all the ghastly things this Labour government has done, this is one of the low points for me. It's outrageous, quite frankly. And it's very clear that Labour has not moved far from the Corbynite Labour Party. Scratch the surface, it's still the same old anti-Semitic Labour Party.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Andrew Fox. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on. I've wanted to talk to you for some time about all the brilliant work you do, especially in relation to the issue of Israel. You've become something of an esteemed commentator and follower of the current conflict and the Israel question more broadly. And now feels like a perfect time to talk to you because you are one of very, very few Britons who's recently been to Gaza. You've recently come back from Gaza. You weren't exactly strolling around Gaza. That would have been incredibly dangerous, but you did see some of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites and you got a sense of what people in Gaza are going through, I think. So to kick off, could you just tell us what it was like, what it felt like to be at one of those aid sites? What the people looked like? What was the atmosphere for you?
I mean, the one thing that really jumps out from the start is the temperature, which is a strange thing to say in many ways, but it's almost hotter there than it is in Israel. So you come across the border, you're in an armored vehicle, body armor, helmet, which is that's not my first rodeo for that kind of thing. But you get out of the vehicles and it's just like being punched in the face with the heat. And that's, I think, really important because it gives you context as to what people are living in. When you think about the local civilians, they're intense. They're not in, aircon buildings like you are in Tel Aviv. So it's clearly everything is harder when it's that temperature because the requirement for food and water goes through the roof. So that really kind of frames it for me, I think, is the temperature. But when you're driving through Rafah, it is devastating. I know ITV put out a video today that they filmed from one of the Jordanian aircraft that's been doing the aid drops, and everyone's very shocked about how destroyed it is, but it's been like that for a year. And I told the Israelis a year ago they needed to get ahead of the problem and start showing the world now before the world found out about it in Rwanda. And Israel's going to get hammered for that, I'd imagine now. But Rafah is absolutely ruined. There's not a single building left standing. They obviously had to blow their way through them as they advanced and cleared. And then now they've bulldozed the rubble, so that's there. And then you get to this distribution site with these big sand walls. The aid's all laid out on one side, the contractors and the American staff are on the other side. And then when the green flag goes up, this just horde of humanity descends on the aid packages, and it's quite something. It was a bit of a sensory overload, quite frankly.
And what was your sense of the people, the condition the people were in? Now, you may not have seen the people in the worst condition because they aren't the people who will be running into an aid center for food. They're going to be at home, in hospital, somewhere else. But from seeing that wave of humanity, and I think it was staggered, wasn't it, between a free-for-all and then later on women and children were given access. What sense did you get of the condition people are in from seeing that kind of wave of people?
Well, the people I saw were okay in the sense that they're trying to survive in a war zone. They weren't anywhere near the sort of Biafran famine that's being portrayed. I think unquestionably there are pockets of the Gaza Strip where people are going genuinely hungry, and I think it would be extremely churlish and foolish to try and deny that. But I think the bulk of the people are getting by, even if they're not perhaps as well fed as we would want them to be. I'd say they're hungry, if not starving. But it was really interesting. There was a sort of a first wave of young men, and we know before the war, Gaza's population was 50% under 18. So it's no surprise that the vast majority of people there are these sort of younger males, and they have all the sort of feral aggression of young men, in a sort of Lord of the Flies kind of situation. There was certainly a free for all, lots with knives. There were a couple of slightly shady characters who are much cleaner, had fancy trainers on, sharp haircuts. They were cutting around at the side, didn't seem that interested in the aid. So
Right.
there's definitely nefarious actors floating around. Uh, the the women and children sort of came, like you said, afterwards, and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation crew kept back like 5% of the aid. So they cleared out all the men, and then only then released that 5% to the women and children, which is really orderly. Actually, it was very chilled. Everyone knew they were going to get something. Nobody was, rugby tackling each other and stuff like that. Lots of smiles, lots of kind of people really delighted to be getting free food for the first time this war. And I think that's notable that actually some of them were surprised that they didn't have to pay for this stuff when it first came, because that's how absolutely corrupt and bent the aid distribution in Gaza has been over the last 22 months.
At the moment, the discussion about Gaza seems to be caught between two different, very, very different views. So on the one side, we're told by the activist class and sections of the media that Israel is intentionally starving people in Gaza. This is part of its so-called genocidal strategy. It's purposely denying them food in order that they will die. Neither you or I buy that. We don't believe that's true. But then on the other side, I guess amongst people who would be more in our camp, there is a tendency to say, actually, it's all fine and there's loads of food. And look at this Gazan person who's slightly overweight, or look at this, why are the parents overweight, but the children are malnourished? You've seen all that discussion yourself. So it's two very different views. Both of them make me feel uncomfortable. I wonder how do you cut through those two views and give a broader sense of what's actually taking place?
Well, I think, start with the UN figures, I think is probably the starting point. Like, there is enough food in Gaza for everyone. There is. 3,000 calories per day plus have gone in to Gaza throughout the war on average. That's more than you or I would need to eat a day to stay healthy. So the food is in there. So the bigger question then is, why are people going hungry? Well, the first thing is clearly, we go back to the UN figures and look at how many of their aid packages have been intercepted, and it's 85% by their last release. Like 85% of their lorries have been intercepted and haven't made it to their destination, which is a staggering failure by the United Nations. Like, why on earth are the UN not getting hammered for this? It's their one job. Their one job is to distribute this aid in Gaza, and they have catastrophically failed to do so for the last year. Now, there's reasons for that. There's the fact it's a war zone. There's the fact that there is multiple militias of psychopaths who are stealing the aid and trying to get it into their warehouses rather than people's stomachs. But why then are the UN not engaging with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who've had a 0% interception rate for their trucks? There's an incoherence here. We obviously have to level the bulk of the blame on Hamas. They are stealing the aid. They are using it to pay their fighters. They're using it to control the people of Gaza. And to be fair, we also have to say that cutting off the aid for 2 months by Israel was a really stupid thing to do. They didn't need to do it. They shouldn't have done it before they had an alternative aid delivery mechanism in place. And it not only put Gazans in a hard place, but it also handed Israel's enemies a free pass to absolutely hammer them with. So there's a variety of factors coming into play here, but the idea that it's just Israel starving people is nonsense, and the idea that everyone is fine is also nonsense. It's shades of grey.
So let's talk a little bit about Hamas's culpability in relation to this, because the blamelessness that is attached to Hamas is the thing that's driven me most mad over the past 2 years of discussion about this conflict. Almost as if Hamas is this entirely blameless entity, did nothing wrong. Maybe it did a bad thing on 7th of October, but since then everything has been Israel's fault. I mean, if you look at the current crisis and the pockets of hunger as you describe it, and the fact that obviously people in Gaza are having a very hard time, explain a little bit about just why Hamas is so hostile to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and what kind of things it's still doing or still hoping to do in order to scupper that aid delivery and to do things a different way. What is Hamas up to at the moment?
So it comes down to control. I think that's the key thing here. If we sort of look at the strategic goals for Hamas, when we talk about the end state that they're trying to achieve, there's two at the moment. There's the international information campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel, mire them down in years, if not decades, of legal challenges to make life difficult for Israelis traveling abroad, that kind of thing. And their second one is just to survive. Because if they survive, they've beaten the Zionist entity. They've beaten this regional superpower who have F-16s and F-35s and 2,000-pound bombs. And that's a very powerful message to the rest of the Middle East. So if we look at how aid factors into both of those things, first of all, if we look at how it degrades Israel, first of all, it suits Hamas for people to go hungry. You know, it gives them pictures, it gives them footage to hammer Israel with on the international stage and blame them for it. So Hamas has every incentive to withhold food from people that aren't affiliated to them. On top of that, it gives them the ability to sell the food, to hoard the food, and in an environment that is so far down on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where shelter and food and water are basically the best people can hope for. If you control any of those things, that gives you huge control over them. So that's what Hamas is trying to do. They're trying to survive, and aid is a key factor in the levers they have to pull to try and ensure that survival.
And in relation to that, how much trouble is Hamas in at the moment? There was an interesting piece in the Washington Post a few weeks back about Hamas being so financially strapped that it can't even pay its fighters anymore. And that's one of the reasons it wants to regain control over aid and food and everything else. We know that they've been pummeled militarily. We know that lots of their fighters have been taken out, and almost all of their leaders, they're replacing them on a monthly basis. What are they like financially, economically? Are they on death's door as a movement, or are they stronger than we might think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's a really irritating phrase that's been used throughout the war, but it does kind of apply here, and that's that you can't kill an idea. Now, you can kill an idea, but what you can't do is create a society in Gaza where there will be no militant groups who are hostile to Israel. So it doesn't matter if you keep degrading. We tend to be lazy. We say Hamas. What we mean is Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and all the other 20 other groups that are in there. You can keep killing the fighters. You can keep destroying their infrastructure. You can keep taking out their leadership. But as long as there are people in Gaza that hate Israel, there will be militias that are hostile to Israel. It's just, that's immutable, I would suggest. So you're right. Hamas have been hammered, 20, 25,000 fighters dead, every commander dead, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels destroyed, rocket capability gone, ability to project power into Israel is gone. So what's the end game for them? Well, it goes back to my original point, that is they just want to survive. And that's why they're hammering Israel in the negotiations to try and get the GHF taken off the table, because it is hurting them. I suspect that might relax now because Israel's been forced by the international pressure to just open the floodgates of aid, which inevitably means that Hamas will be given a reprieve. It was working. Now they've got aid in there unrestricted, then that's always going to end up in Hamas's pockets. So they probably had a bit of a foot off the gas for that. But the second it goes back on again, if it does, it's going to be the same deal for them. They think in generations. They're not going to care that they've lost all their fighters now. As long as they exist, they know they can rebuild over 20, 30, even 50, 100 years, and they can keep taking the fight back to Israel. So it's not a promising or happy outlook.
Yeah. Okay. Right. That's quite sobering, but useful nonetheless. There's one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I find myself just not believing anything I read about this conflict in the media. It's really hard not to become cynical, but it's that's the way things are. What I did want to ask you about the so-called aid massacres. Now, even that is not the right phrase, because if you look at the information that's come out, A lot of these shootings have taken place quite some distance from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites. The GHF says, look, these are not happening within our facilities, so stop misrepresenting them. You've written about this for Spike. You've written about the so-called killing fields, and you've described quite well how awful these situations are, but how they do sometimes happen in bloody, confusing, chaotic war zones. Judging by the media coverage, they seem to happen quite a lot, whatever they are, whether they are just, confusing attacks on very large gatherings of people some distance from an aid center or something else. They do seem to be happening quite frequently. Is that your sense? What do you think is going on with these seemingly large-scale shootings that we certainly read about every day?
I mean, it's impossible to say. I mean, the Israelis have admitted that there have been some incidents where they've opened fire and killed people. But also the GHF tell me that there are absolutely fabricated incidents as well. So their media team will get phone calls saying, "Oh, this has happened today. What can you say about it?" They'll phone down to the distribution sites and they won't have a clue what they're talking about. So there is definitely sort of shenanigans going on there with Hamas. Hamas is trying to sort of force people off the beaten track. So there's this very, very clearly defined route that people have to take. They're not allowed to stray off it. And if they do stray off it, then warning shots get fired. But there's scattered IDF sort of pockets, I'm told, around that area. So if you suddenly get a crowd of hundreds coming off the beaten track and approaching an Israeli base, then they're not shy of opening fire when that happens. But, I spoke to the GHF people in terms of figures, the Gaza Ministry of Health run by Hamas, they've pushed out lie after lie during this war that we've caught them out in. Things like the Al-Ahli Arab hospital bombing, where they claimed 500 people had died when Israel hit a hospital, and that went globally worldwide. The next day, it turned out 50 people were dead, and they'd hit the car park, and it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. So, the health ministry have lied and lied and lied throughout this war. The American contractors, who are pretty neutral, they're not super pro-IDF. You'd be surprised. Some of them were quite... They sort of shared my opinion that you shouldn't be doing live fire crowd control. And they were kind of annoyed at that because they're there to help people. They don't want to see people getting shot. They were adamant. It's probably a tenth of what's being reported.
Yeah.
But again, there's no evidence one way or the other for that. But it's still two stories competing, two very, very different narratives. And that's kind of the story of the war, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I've got a few more questions on that story of the war in a moment. But just staying with the aid thing for 1 minute. You said earlier that the borders have now kind of been opened for aid, at least for aid drops from the sky. Israel does seem to have responded to the international pressure, whether one thinks that pressure was fair or unfair, well-informed or ill-informed. Regardless, Israel does seem to have responded to it. There are airdrops by other nations. What will the consequences of that be? You think it might tone down the tensions between Hamas and the GHF because Hamas will benefit from this new aid? Will it be able to go back to the system that it had previously? How do you think the introduction of more forms of aid, even though it will be good for people who do manage to get it, what warping consequences could it potentially have on the conflict?
Well, it all depends if they've actually done anything to fix the distribution. Because, as I said, we already know there's enough food in there, even before you start shoving more food in. So it kind of doesn't matter how much food you put in if it's not reaching the people who actually need it. And there's harrowing, endless stories about people telling how hungry they are as they go for medical aid in Jordan or whatever it might be. Like, it's clearly not getting through. So what is the UN actually doing practically here, other than driving a lorry into Gaza, letting it get hijacked, and then they never see it again? Because I think that's what's happening. All the videos we're seeing is lorry after lorry after lorry getting hijacked, and the aid goes somewhere, and who knows at this point. So yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that flooding Gaza with aid is the answer. I think distribution is the issue. And actually, I think the GHF model is the answer. It doesn't necessarily have to be GHF doing this. It could be another NGO of some description. But clearly, the way to make sure the people who need food get food is to make sure the aid, when it enters Gaza, reaches its distribution point without being hijacked. And then at the distribution point, it actually gets handed to the people who are needy. And that seems far more logical to me than just throwing random lorries into Gaza and hoping that people can find dinner if they get lucky. It's not ideal.
Yeah, absolutely not ideal. And What explains the UN's failings on this front? How do you explain their failure to distribute or their failure to take seriously even such a serious matter as 85% of their trucks being hijacked? And why are they so hostile to the GHF? Is this just UN hostility to Israel? What explains their kind of sitting on their hands during a crisis?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're compromised beyond repair at this point. We know UNRWA employees took part in 7th of October. We know hundreds of Hamas members sit on UNRWA's staff. Yeah, the UN, I think, is so completely corrupted by the Palestinian issue at this point that it would rather see people starve than work with the Israelis, and it's utter madness. And even they even told me that they've been helping out other NGOs, the GHF. They've moved stuff for them. They put their food in or their stocks into shade for them, and even then they've still gone on and absolutely crucified them in the media. So there's a real NGO racket here, and I think it's essentially it's almost like strike busting, it's union busting by the GHF. This is a racket that's making an awful lot of people incredibly wealthy, from Hamas leadership through to a variety of NGOs on the ground, and threatening that aid distribution model threatens their business model, and it's the whole thing stinks, if I'm absolutely honest.
Yeah, I think those are quite powerful words, that the UN would rather see people starve than associate with Israel or Israeli groups. And I think that's very well said, very apt. Okay, you mentioned earlier about the amount of misinformation we've got from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. Every time I hear that phrase, I just think, why are you quoting a psychopathic movement that, takes pleasure from killing Jewish people? It's such a strange thing to see the mainstream media do. I wanted to ask you a few questions about the truth about the war as you understand it, and cutting through the misreporting, the misinformation, just the general, I think, myth making around this conflict. And the one thing I wanted to ask you about, because you have commented on this before, is the fatality figures and the casualty figures. Now, they're obviously high. How could they not be? This is a pretty fierce war in a small patch of land against an enemy that thinks nothing of hiding in civilian infrastructure. The number we hear is 60,000. We're never given a breakdown of who those 60,000 people are, whether they're militants or not. Let's start with the fatality figures. What's your understanding of the truth of that? Is it 60,000? Who are these people? What has happened there, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the general pattern, I mean, I haven't been there, I haven't counted body bags myself, I couldn't give you an accurate figure, but the general pattern for previous wars is the numbers given by both sides tend to be there or thereabouts right, in terms of the total number of dead on the Gazan side, and on the total number of combatants killed on the Israeli side. So historical precedent gives us a rough kind of suggestion that these figures may be accurate, but you have to unpack the 60,000. At least 20,000 of those Hamas fighters, I would suggest substantially more, especially when you factor into the fact that Hamas are well on record of using child fighters. And I've certainly seen confirmed social media accounts that even as young as 13-year-old boys have been killed and then praised as mujahideen or martyrs, shaheed at the end of it. So, they're really using children here. So, and that's paid out. If you look at how the demographics break down, there is a huge spike in men between the ages of about 15 and 45. That fighting age range is overwhelming. It's like 72% of that age range is men. And that, I think, clearly suggests that Israel is targeting combatants rather than just indiscriminately slaughtering their way through the Gaza Strip. If we look at other things like the number of, when you look at the orphans or people children who've lost one parent or the other, overwhelmingly children have lost male parents. So there's this kind of, there's periphery information here that kind of gives us a bit more context and flavor as to what these numbers actually consist of. Will there be some missing? Yes. But have most of them been reported? Also, probably yes. They're quite incentivized to do this. Anyone could fill in the form that submits a name of someone who's been killed. I could go on the internet now and submit Brandon O'Neill as a Gazan who's died. I'd have to invent some extra information, but it's an open source form. They're supposed to be ratified by Hamas judges, which in and of itself is problematic, I think. Again, given that Hamas are clearly a combatants in this war who are not the most ethical and moral and upstanding individuals in the world. So we've got a variety of methodological problems here that I think make these forms quite unreliable. But there's unlikely to be that many missing because it's so easy to report someone missing. So 7,000 or so sounds about realistic to me. So yeah, there's, it's a war zone, fog of war. The really interesting thing, I think, is what other war in history do you get a running drumbeat of deaths, and in what other war in history is that somehow the most important thing?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't matter, from like take morality out of it, legally, ethically, different things. Like when it comes to fighting a war, it doesn't matter how many people die. Like hundreds of thousands of people died in wars gone past. We don't say, oh, the World War II was terrible because millions died and therefore it was an unethical, evil war. We understand that World War II had to be fought against fascist Nazism, and therefore those deaths were worth it. And likewise, huge civilian death toll. And we don't say we shouldn't have fought World War II because lots of civilians died. So straight away, the framing of this war is different to any other war, and the framing of Israel's wars always are. But it's a very double standard.
It really is extraordinary. I was watching BBC News at 10 just the other night, and the opening story was, I think 11 children had reportedly died of malnourishment in Gaza, and they focused on it, and it was a long video piece, and it went on. And then the very last item on News at 10 was that hundreds have died of starvation in Nigeria over the past 6 months. Like a footnote, and I'm sure there are many people out there who don't even know that there is hunger in Nigeria, and also, of course, Sudan, even more pointedly. So I think you've just given a very good description there of what that 60,000 figure might represent. And to me, the most striking thing is the refusal of the media to ever mention how many of them are combatants. It's almost like Hamas is invisibilized from the whole thing. You don't hear that they're fighting. You don't hear that they're still firing their guns, that they're terrorists, they're still being killed in battle. What do you think is the motivation there amongst the media outlets to, I guess, park their critical faculties on questions like this, and to parrot those figures without ever breaking them down, or without ever thinking in that historical perspective you've just given, which is that wars are horrible and people die? Is this just the issue of Israelophobia? Is it now so entrenched in our media ecosystem that we should just not even expect them to do the bare minimum like that?
Yeah, it's been utterly negligent. We did a bit of study on this with our partners, 40 Global, and we found of all the major news outlets reporting on the casualty numbers, 3% used the Israeli Defense Forces figures of how many combatants they killed. It was even worse than I thought it would be. I knew it would be low, but 3%, absolutely outrageous. And there seems to be this kind of very strange phenomena where everything Israel says is to be doubted and not reported unless verified, and everything Hamas say is to be cited verbatim unless you can disprove it on the spot. It's a really weird inversion of how things ought to be. It does date back to, there's books written on East German approaches to Israel in the 1970s, and if I gave you the page that talks about the information strategy, you'd recognize it. It's disbelieve Israel, devalue Israel, discredit Israel at every turn, and Palestinians are always to be boosted and to be taken at face value. And that's an explicitly stated propaganda strategy that's been dug out from old Eastern European papers, and yet we're seeing it play out in real time in front of us. And it's so irresponsible. Israel is a democratic state. It is a state that has accountability. It's a state that is investigating over 1,000 of its soldiers for potential war crimes right now. Is it perfect? Well, of course it's not. No country is. We certainly aren't. And yet there's this strange disbelief Israelis, and I don't know if it's connected to that strange Soviet propaganda campaign that emerged with Arafat. I don't know if it's anti-Semitism. That gets thrown around a lot these days when I think it shouldn't probably apply, but it might apply in this instance. It certainly would do with Al Jazeera and other kind of sort of more Eastern-facing media outlets. But in the West, I don't understand it. I really don't.
So let's talk a bit about the G word, genocide. It's an idea you and I both reject, and so do many other people as well. In fact, not as many as I would like, but we are out there criticizing this notion that Israel is committing a genocide. Um, how do you respond to that conversation? I mean, I find it kind of infuriating, but obviously one needs to respond to it. How do you respond to it, and why do you think that is starting to stick? So we're not just talking now about the usual suspects beating the streets with their Palestine flags and saying Israel is committing genocide. Governments have said it. I mean, the Irish government says it, and some officials in Europe have said it as well. The ICJ has been doing its thing. What's your response to that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear with the ICJ, that's just a case that's been brought. The ICJ hasn't made any rulings on this, much as people like to misrepresent what they've said. But I think it's important to be clear about that. But yeah, look, there's a degree of circular reporting here, where these governments are relying on the same very few sources. It's not like they've gone out, done their own independent investigations and separately to any other country come up with the conclusion that it's genocide. They're all relying on the same very limited bank of information that's out there. And there is probably, of course, also some coordination as well between them. But my main, I've started reacting with almost contempt at this point because it's so demonstrably not a genocide.
Yeah.
That actually, by giving it a serious answer and a serious rebuttal, you're almost dignifying these outrageous blood libels.
Yeah.
Frankly, there's no intent. Like, where is the Wannsee conference for the genocide in Gaza? Yes, you've got monsters like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and I have no hesitation calling them that. The stuff they say is appalling and disgusting. But the stuff they've cited in the ICJ case particularly is totally out of context. Speeches by Bibi or Yoav Gallant, where they're very clearly talking about Hamas, if you read the rest of the paragraph that's cited, but they're cherry-picking these sentences to make it look as bad as possible. But then we have to go to the next fact, is that armies don't take orders from press conferences. When we were in Afghanistan, we didn't take orders from Gordon Brown in Downing Street giving an announcement about Afghanistan. There was a very clear chain of command, and orders were written and planning processes were done, and eventually it got down to the ground level. That's not how armies work. You don't say Amalek and then all of a sudden the IDF go, great, let's massacre everyone. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So yeah, with the genocide thing, I don't take it even seriously at this point because it's so demonstrably not the case, and it's blatantly a disingenuous, cynical blood libel that I've got no time for.
I think your use of the term blood libel is very fitting there. And does it worry you that there's this broader? It's almost as if the crimes of history are now being pinned on the Jews. I mean, that you said earlier that it's it might be anti-Semitism in certain quarters, it might be something else in other quarters, but the determination with which some people seem willing to find the Jewish state guilty of the crime that was infamously committed against the Jews themselves 80 years ago. There's something very strange going on there, isn't there? Some kind of historical projection or historical absolution on the part of young European people, perhaps. What do you think is going on with just the myopia and fury with which that word is tagged to Israel more than any other nation?
Yeah, I think it tags to that strange inversion that started with Arafat in 1964, where all of a sudden Palestinian had a new meaning. It never meant the separate country that used to be Palestine and was colonized by the Jews. It was never that meaning until Arafat turned up, backed by the Soviet Union, backed by the USSR. The Palestinian football team used to play football with the Star of David and was made up of Jews. That was a complete inversion of what Palestine meant. And that's really the specialty of this particular propaganda campaign is inversion.
Yeah.
Israeli women were monstrously raped on 7th of October. And yet the main rape allegations you've heard about for the last 22 months are these utterly unjustified and unproven allegations against IDF soldiers. And it's about really co-opting the language of what the Jewish people have been through and turning it on its head into some sort of twisted way to make the Palestinians be the victims. When, this is a nuanced, desperately complicated, decades-long conflict that has terrible things on both sides at certain times. If we look at what some of the Jewish militias got up to in 1947-48, there's some pretty shady stuff there. If we look at kind of some of what happened to Arab settlements in the aftermath of 1948. Again, not great. And then we've got intifadas, and we've got bombings, and we've got murders all over the shop. And we look at what the more extreme settlers are doing in the West Bank. That's not good either.
Yeah.
So this is incredibly nuanced. But the point is, it's been presented as simply the Jewish state just endlessly beating on these poor, vulnerable, oppressed Arabs. Is how it's portrayed, and that really could not be further from the truth.
So I want to ask you about, you mentioned their nuance, and that's a nice thing to have. But at the moment, we've got a lot of politicians blundering into this conflict in a way that is not helpful. And I'm thinking of Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Mark Carney, all of whom have either said they will recognize the state of Palestine, or in Starmer's case, which in some ways is even worse, he says he will recognize it unless Israel jumps through the following hoops before September. What have you made of that? What are the potential consequences of those three very powerful men indicating that they're going to recognize the state of Palestine, even as the conflict is ongoing, even as Hamas still holds hostages? What's happening there?
Well, I think Starmer in particular is being doubly weaselly here, because the memorandum of understanding that they signed with the state of Palestine back in April this year kind of made the mainstream yesterday. And it's just astonishing. It's a commitment to Palestine on 1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital. Very importantly, they had some commitments to gender equality and doing something about climate change. So clearly, fingers fully on the pulse of what really matters in the Middle East. But the document makes very clear that I think the UK is going to do this whatever Israel does. I don't think there's any doubt at all. But the fact that then Mr. Starmer is trying to use it to blackmail Israel is absolutely beyond the pale, quite frankly. And when we look at how they've played this, it's just so naive and stupid. Carney saying that he supports it if there's a free and fair election in the West Bank, but Hamas can't be part of it. Well, guess what? Hamas is polling at 70% in the West Bank right now.
Wow.
Is the great colonial master in Canada going to come down and tell Palestinians who they can vote for? Macron, this comes in, not long after this Qatari visit that happened earlier this year. No surprise that the French mood has changed, even counteracting what Mr. Macron himself said only recently about how foolish it would be to blunder in and try to create a state of Palestine. And it's not really going to have any effective distance on the ground. Israel's never going to agree to this nonsense.
Wow.
But what it has done is massively emboldened Hamas.
Yeah.
They almost had a ceasefire deal over the line last week until these clowns waded in. And Hamas immediately doubled down on their negotiating position and refused to sign a deal. And quite frankly, off the back of that, if Hamas does end up killing those poor hostages whose videos we saw this week, then there are drops of blood on the hands of these leaders. Like, they have very possibly killed hostages. It's of all the ghastly things this Labour government has done, this is one of the low points for me, and it's outrageous, quite frankly. And I don't like to get wound up about things or angry, but this one actually makes my blood boil, because it's so disingenuous. And it's very clear that Labour has not moved far from the Corbynite Labour Party. They're, scratch the surface, and it's still the same old anti-Semitic Labour Party. Utterly shameful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was thinking just the other day that this is one of the worst things this Labour government has done. And that's saying something, because they've done some pretty shoddy things over the past year or so. What do you think is Starmer's motivation here? I mean, you say that the government's going to do it anyway, regardless of whether Israel bows down to its demands or not. What's his motivation? What's he trying to achieve? Is this just entirely for domestic consumption rather than thinking through anything globally or geopolitically?
I'm certain it is. It's too clumsy for anyone to have given it any thought about the geopolitical ramifications of what they're doing. Look, 5 or 6 million Muslims in the UK, 250,000 Jews. Like, it's very obvious which constituency is where the votes are. And I think their position is Israel and the Jews be damned. There are 6 million Muslim votes that I need to shore up now, because I lost 5 MPs to Gaza seats in the last general election. Jeremy Corbyn's just created his Jezbollah, or whatever they're calling it. And Starmer's going to have real electoral pressure with that segment of Labour's electorate. It's quite nakedly just playing to the crowd. But my goodness, what a foolish move! What a yeah, I'm always speechless at how crass and poorly thought through this is.
You mentioned the hostages there, and I did want to ask you about them. So we've seen the footage of Aviator David and Ron Brazlowski in shocking condition. One being forced to dig his own grave for the cameras, the other having the camera pan up and down his body as he kind of weeps in pain. I mean, if anything has echoed Nazi Europe over the past 20 or so months, 22 months, it's this. This is emaciated Jews being turned into a spectacle for the world to gawk at. It's really astonishingly depraved. What do you think is? We understand why Hamas would do something like this to these two men and the other hostages, because it is a barbaric organization, an anti-Semitic organization. What do you think was their motivation in releasing the videos, in being boastful about what they had done? Do you think they sense that? Do they sense that emboldenment that you've talked about? Do they now think they can get away with anything? What do you think motivated them there?
I think they're trying to shatter Israeli support for the war effort. I think it's directly aimed at the cohesion of Israeli society and their ongoing support for the war. And it's very clever because, if we could put our war studies nerd hats on, this is just good Clausewitzian Trinity stuff. The consent of the population, the will of the population is absolutely one of the most important things you need, along with the armed forces and the political will to keep a war going. It's aimed at Bibi, it's aimed at wounding Israelis, and I think there is also an element of taunting. There's been a lot of taunting from Hamas during this war. Like midway through last year, there was this ludicrous spate of just beheaded dolls they were waving around, claiming that these munitions had somehow just beheaded a child without touching the rest of the body, which is nonsense if you know how these explosives work. And obviously that was taunting back to the 40 beheaded babies communications error that happened on 7th of October that was quickly rebutted. This is taunting them. They're saying, look, we've persuaded the world that you are committing deliberate starvation. Now we are actually starving 2 of yours, and still the world believe us over you. That's the message. It's just they are psychological masters. This kind of savagery on a mental level. They're incredibly good at it, and this is just another example of that.
Yeah, that's well put. Okay, Andrew, to finish, I want to ask you a little bit about what's happening here at home and the impact that this war has had domestically, or really what it's brought to the surface domestically. I mean, lots of these trends and things that people like you and I worry about have existed long before 7th of October 2023. But, it is still extraordinary to me, almost 2 years later, that you had the worst attack on Jews for a very, very long time. And somehow, over the course of weeks and months, educated young people in the West essentially took the side of Hamas. Lots of influential activists did, lots of people on social media did, and right up to media people and political people were making excuses for the people who carried that act out. The optimist in me thinks that at least future historians will look back on this period with a sense of bewilderment, even if many people don't do that right now. How do you explain that? Was that as bad as you thought it was going to be after 7th of October, or was it worse than you thought it would be? This kind of sympathy for the devil, I guess, that we saw after that event.
I think in hindsight, I was naive until 7th of October 2023. Not from what happened in Israel, but what I saw on the streets of London.
Right.
That blew my mind. Genuinely, I didn't think we were that bad. I didn't think our society was in that bad a state. But I think the Gaza war has not only ripped the mask off there, but I think it's potentially broken us as a society. Look, we've got people breaking onto Royal Air Force bases and damaging strategic assets. But the UK can't affect this war. We've got no agency at all. We can't stop it. We can't make Israel back off. We can't make Hamas back off. We don't have any power here at all. Any agency we did have under the Conservatives, David Lammy's burned in about 2 minutes the minute he got into office. So there's nothing the UK can do. We've got people attacking police officers with sledgehammers in Elbit factories in Bristol. And then we've got thousands of people chanting on the streets in support of Hamas's war aims. They'll say that they're against the war, and they'll say that it's nothing to do with Hamas, but actually they're operating on disinformation and lies about what Israel's doing. And the effect is absolutely in support of Hamas's war aims. And yet people can't see that because they're just so upset by the images that are pouring out of Gaza in a way they're not pouring out of other much worse war zones around the country, as you've already alluded to. It's places like Sudan, Nigeria, Ukraine even. So yeah, I think we're in real trouble. I think we're in real trouble as a society.
Okay, Andrew, my last question for you, which kind of follows on from that, which is that you and I are pro-Israel, and other people are as well. I saw you give an excellent speech at a pro-Israel rally in Westminster. I don't know when that was, 6 months ago, a while back.
Yeah, it's just before Christmas. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
And I think it's important to do that. We live in a moment of, I would say, moral derangement. Things do feel like they're falling apart. I think what our societies have done, or certain constituencies in our society have done after 7th of October, is unforgivable and incredibly dangerous. So how can one carry on making the case for Israel while also, I guess, being a critical friend? You've made a few critical comments during this conversation, and you've talked about some of the mistakes Israel has made. I think there is a tendency on our side not to draw attention to those things because the hatred for Israel is so intense and so irrational and so disproportionate that you don't want to say anything that might give succor to that side of it. So there is that understandable tendency, and lots of my friends share that tendency, and I understand why. How can one be a critical friend of Israel, and how important do you think it is for the more reasoned of us to be a friend of Israel in a moment like this?
I mean, look, I'm a military analyst. That's my job. If I don't maintain a degree of balance, then I'm useless. Like, nothing good I say will be of any use if I don't say anything critical.
Yeah.
Because I'll just be a cheerleader if I do that. And Israel has a number of those, and I don't think they particularly help matters, apart from making Jewish people and Israelis feel a bit better about themselves. And I think it really boils down to what you want to achieve. Because look, at the moment, it's a really hard time for British people, British Jewish people. And, you and I are both very lucky. We've got voices that we can use in public, and a lot of people will see those comments that we make and those statements that we come out with. So I think it's beholden on us to let the Jewish people know that we stand with them, and that is unreserved and doesn't need any qualification. But by the same token, when we're discussing Israel, that's a slightly different matter. And I think to be a responsible commentator, you have to take the good with the bad and say it plainly. But it's the language you use. I think you don't have to get hysterical. This is an outrage. I call for X, Y, Z. You can just state it plainly. And I think that is actually a lot more impactful when you then say something good.
Andrew, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.